Okay. When looking up data usage and business intelligence, I discovered some interesting statistics like the global business intelligence adoption rate is 26%. Organizations tend to use four or more different business intelligence tools on average. Organizations leave 97% of gathered data unused. 74% of employees feel unhappy or overwhelmed when working with data. Businesses using business intelligence are 5 times more likely to reach decisions faster than those that do not. And bad data costs the US economy alone $3.1 trillion each year. Now, our guest today may have a solution that goes some way towards overcoming the difficulties that many businesses face in using and leveraging data for decision making, and we'll dive into that in just a bit. Hello, and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutworth.com. I'm Vinay Koshy, and our guest today is Ryan Janssen. Now, Ryan, you're the CEO of Zenalytic, a business intelligence tool that you can talk to. And I believe you've raised 2 rounds of funding, investors including Bain Capital Ventures, Primary Ventures, and the Sequoia Scout Fund. You were previously a venture capitalist with London's AGC Equity Partners, where you invested in SaaS businesses from seed to growth, advised a number of them as well as an advisor or board member, and you also have experience with technology, private equity, and management consulting with McKinsey and Ernst & Young. I'm curious, Ryan, you and Paul co-founded Zenalytic. How did the two of you meet up, and what was the genesis moment, as it were, for Zenalytic as we know it today?
Yeah, for sure. First, thank you very much for having me on the
Pleasure.
pod. And those stats are amazing. I would love to, I wish you were selling Zenlytic because they're all very compelling. Yeah, so Paul and I originally met in grad school. After I was a VC, I guess our last fund at the time was a big data fund we were putting it
Right.
together, and I was doing the research behind it. And just understanding and seeing where the market had moved since I had last been an engineer 7 years earlier, I was absolutely blown away at the capabilities of the tech and what you could do with some of these big data technologies. And most importantly, that it seemed to be accelerating, which are all those sort of little warning signs you think that you're onto something big. I got so excited by that. I said, I can't just invest in this sort of market. I have to participate. And that's what led me to actually get started on the data journey. Step one in that journey was going and brushing up on my technical skills. So I went and did a master's degree in computational data science, first to catch up and understand what all these new technologies were capable of and learn the state of the art. Secondly, was to meet a founding team. And that's where I met Paul, our CTO, and one of the smartest people I know. And actually, a huge amount of our technical team comes from that same alumni group.
Ah,
So we just had an offer accepted. I think we're up to, I think of the 7 people on our engineering team, I think 5 of them all come from that same
oh,
program.
wow. Okay. A bit of a small world, but I can understand how you've had a meeting of minds, so to speak, in order to bring this together. You've both had entrepreneurial experiences. I'm curious, how did that help you start Zenlytics?
I would say the most helpful part of my background in venture capital when starting Zenlytic was actually pain tolerance or just like a cool demeanor. People always think that you're a VC and you become a founder and you have a big network and that's helpful, and that's helpful to a certain extent. That would be probably a pretty distant third for me. Number two would be my ability to speak the language when fundraising. We've never actually fundraised from funds in my network, interestingly enough, but I think we've always had good success with it because I'm able to talk to investors. So that's been
Right.
helpful. The most important thing, though, is it takes a lot of nerve to run an early stage startup. It's a roller coaster ride, and any given day you go back and forth from saying, "I we are the smartest people in the world. We're absolute geniuses. We are crushing this," and then something happens 4 hours later, and you're like, "We are total idiots. What were we thinking? We have no idea what we're doing." And just back and forth constantly. And when I was a VC, you have an entire portfolio of companies who are doing those same roller coaster rides. And you don't experience it as viscerally as the founders, but any given day, you go into work and 3 of your 12 portfolio companies are at the nadir of the roller coaster and they think they're total idiots. And after you experience that for years and you understand that's just a fact of life in early stage startups, you tend to get a sense of the rhythm of how these things work. And I guess when it happens to you, you can keep your cool. So I think that's been super duper
Hmm.
helpful. My co-founder Paul was not a VC, but he is a rock climber, which I think is also a group known for their relatively cool
Hmm.
demeanor under pressure. So I think the two of us have been well suited for that, and I think that's really managed to smooth out a lot of the vicissitudes of early stage life.
I'm also curious, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
Great question. I would say I am one of the least strong members of the team because I'm the jack of all trades. I would say that I am technical, I'm experienced in venture and startup building, and I'm an operator. So I'd say my weakness and my strength is both
Okay.
those things, actually. I couldn't do any of the jobs that anyone does in our talented team by myself, but I know just enough that I'm able to glue those together,
Hmm.
basically. I would say I'd give myself a gold star for being more technical. I think that's one of the more rare things that you see in a CEO. I think a lot of
Hmm.
startup founders and CEOs have to be generalists, but there's a lot that do it without having that technical background. So being a big nerd myself who's just incredibly passionate about data and the data technology behind it, I think that that drives the organization because passion drives these organizations. And I'd say it's a double-edged sword with the rest of the team. On one hand, it's great because they can bring a problem to me and I can understand the context very
Hmm.
quickly. I also understand some of the really annoying things about being an engineer. I managed to avoid those. I understand the concept of the person month or the mythical. There's a book called the Mythical Man Month, but now it's a person month, and I understand how it's very difficult to estimate some creative processes like development in advance. So very rarely on the team will you see me say, how many days is it going to take to get done? You said this is going to take 5 days and it took 8 days. What's up with that? So being technical, I have a lot of sympathy for that. And that's a very positive thing that I bring to the
Sure.
team. And then the flip side of it is that it's pretty hard to fool me technically. So if someone says, "Oh, this is going to take a long time," and I'll say, "Oh, actually, you can just use an on drag handle for that in React and it should be very quickly. Have you tried doing this?" And yes, okay. So it's hard to pull a fast one on a technical CEO too. So I guess our engineering team probably loves it and hates it, but I think that's one of the unique things about my background that makes me well suited to be running Zenalytic.
Okay. And in that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
Yeah, so this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and this is an excellent segue into the state of business intelligence today. Every company, whether they know it or not, is using BI, right? So like they're trying to use numbers. So it's one of the most important functions that a business can do. And you mentioned some of those amazing stats at the start. I like to think about some of the fastest growing companies in the world over the last 10 years, some of the
Mhm.
FANGs, for instance, or some of the leading companies. We've seen that Fortune 10 be completely replaced from what was originally a bunch of energy companies and big generalized industrial companies. Now the 10 largest companies in the world are all tech driven. And even though their business models are quite different, things like, so we have a social network, we have an enterprise software company, and we have a hardware manufacturer, and we have content streaming services. Those are all very different businesses, but what they do in common is they're all very good at using data. And Netflix is famously great for data, and Facebook has invented a lot of the modern data technology. And I think that's probably one of the reasons. One of the few things they all have in common. That's one of the reasons why they've been so successful. Famous venture capitalist Tomas Tungas says the 2020s are the decade of
Mhm.
data. He made that prediction at the dawn of the decade, and so far it's proven to be very true. It's a competitive advantage now, right? It's how you run a business. The challenge of it, though, is that it's a giant mess,
Hmm.
right? Data is an incredibly messy thing to get into. It's a lot of work to set up, to process, to clean, to understand. And as a result, you have an incredibly high dynamic range of capabilities across organizations. And everyone wants to be in the top 10%, but no one really knows how. So I would say, to answer your question, is like what that sort of background and my technical background, my love of data, and I'd say our team wise love of data brings to those organizations, or what we bring to people, are the ability to simplify that situation, to make it more accessible, to make it more understandable. That's the Zen part of Zenlytic, is just taking what's a very messy sort of spaghetti ridden process and turn it into something straightforward.
That's brilliant because I remember from our last conversation, you were saying that for about 30 years, the past 30 years, people said self-serve BI wasn't achievable. Now, obviously, AI has been a big jump forward in this space, but have there been any other technology innovations that have helped to break down that barrier that we should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. We are at a unique time in the history of data now because we're seeing the convergence of two big technologies. One you mentioned, artificial intelligence. The second one is called the modern data stack, which is a collection of terms for just a bunch of great tools that have evolved over the last few years that make it much, much easier to build and maintain data than ever before. The most famous of these is probably Snowflake, which is the backbone is these cloud data warehouses, and the rise of these data warehouses have been both large. I think the amount of data stored in the cloud has gone from 25% to 75% over the last
Oh,
5 years or something like that for corporate data. So the change has been large, and also it's very powerful, right? So like it makes data much more accessible, and you can't make bricks without clay. That's where you need to start by to be data ready is actually to have the data. And I guess if you look at what Snowflake's done, when we started building Zenalytic, Snowflake was a Series C business or something like that, and it was doing $90 million a year in revenue, and now we're routing from 2 to 3 billion a year. So that growth in a very short period of time, I think, is reflective of that. And then around that sort of foundation, there's been a bunch of other tools like dbt, which is a tool for building data pipelines, and fivetran, which helps you ingest data from all of your sources into that Snowflake. And these tools have collected together to form the modern data stack. Entirely new job titles have really emerged as a result. Nowadays, someone who operates that stack is called an analytics engineer, and that was an unheard of title about 5 years ago. Now it's one of the most desirable jobs you can
right.
have. It's a really interesting job. So yeah, that's the one big part of it. The interesting thing is, so BI tools very much benefit from that, and we're a business intelligence tool. You mentioned for 30 years that people are saying self-serve is impossible. It turns out they were right. Actually, for the past 30 years, it's been very difficult because data is hard to work with. It's really hard to make it accessible to a non-technical end user. The thing that's really changed to make it possible now is the other big trend you mentioned, artificial intelligence. And we could do an entire podcast on what's happening here, but I have no doubt. I've seen the capabilities of this tech, and I have no doubt that it's going to be transformative for pretty much every software vertical. It unlocks a lot of new comprehension capabilities that were never possible before. It just so happens that data is one of the verticals that will benefit the most from it. I think yes, that is the other big trend that's happening. The modern data stack has been happening for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's now reaching maturity. The AI stuff has been happening for about a year now, but it's rapidly maturing. And just like I observed 5 years ago when I made the jump, it continues to accelerate, which is really amazing to me that even technology that's moving this fast continues to move faster and faster. So those two things together, I think, are starting to intersect. And I think as they continue to mature, they're going to be pretty powerful for self-serve business intelligence.
Indeed, very powerful. I'm curious, specifically, how would you say are large language models making self-serve BI a reality? Because one of the thoughts that came to mind as you were speaking was, would it be possible for perhaps a data analyst or a data scientist who uses perhaps a BI tool, a more traditional BI tool, to leverage large language models, and I'm thinking more of custom large language models specific to their particular company, to do perhaps a lot of what a self-serve BI tool could do.
Yes, I would say that's certainly possible. And we encounter people who do that all the time too, where they'll build some system internally to use their data. And I guess this is the old build versus buy argument. Again, it's probably true in a lot of verticals. I would say absolutely possible because these LLMs are powerful and there are powerful APIs available to everyone, which I think is really exciting. One of the interesting learnings that we've had from working with LLM technology is that it can be deceptively simple. And what I mean by that is that these LLMs are trivially easy to start a toy example or a little POC practice model. You can go into the ChatGPT window and you could probably start a self-serve BI tool that looks neat on a toy set of data in about half an hour. It would look great for that little toy example. The challenge of working with LLMs increases on an exponential relationship with the scale of the problem. And what that means is once you take that up to production grade and you start adding in a lot of other information, and eventually the context window size breaks, so you can't actually put everything into one window. And then you've got too much data to handle from one LM, and all these sort of problems tend to arise as you scale it up. It actually becomes really difficult to make it work at scale. At the small scale, it's actually easier. It's easier and faster than most technology.
Okay, brilliant. And I was wondering if you could give us an example of a data team that you've helped to reduce ad hoc requests And what sort of results did they see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for some context, and this is just generally true of all the companies we work with and all the companies using BI right now. The current state of BI is that dashboards have been the only choice for
Yeah.
many years. The standard BI usage case is you'll check your daily flash report or your quarterly report, and there'll be some form of regular update that's been designed once and then refreshed continuously. Those are great, and a lot of data nerds like to say dashboards are dead. They're not going to be. They're not dead. They're very useful, but the usage pattern is always the same. So someone will look at a dashboard, they'll see something that looks interesting to them, and that's about as far as they can get without resorting to the help from a tech. So they'll say, "Oh, huh, that's funny. Our conversion rate dipped over Black Friday, Cyber Monday weekend. I wonder why it was lower than last year." And they will then their next step, of course, would be to reach out to the data team. "Oh, hey, listen, I need some help with this. Can you show me this by SKU, or can you show me this by level of discount? And can you show me this whether or not the person is a subscription or a premium user, and if it's a first-time purchase or not?" And a whole analysis comes out of that, and it's a lot of iteration between that data person and whoever's viewing the dashboard, right? So it's slicing and dicing that. The data person is writing SQL, is making visualizations. They go back and change things. Unfortunately, the data person there's one data person for every 50 people in an organization now, even for a leading organization. Sometimes there's 1 in 200 people. That data person has dozens or hundreds of people making those requests, right? So there's lots of people they need to take care of, and they do not have the bandwidth for that. As a result, time cycles slow down, so you get something you want weekly instead of monthly, and you're back to the bottom of the pile, and it's waiting for several days for that. You can't focus and really drill into the details that you'd like to. And I've lived this life too, so it's been a massive pain for me, and it's also very painful for the end users who are just waiting for their data. This is why it's actually interesting that LLMs are arising, is because, and this is why I say that data has such a great opportunity with LLMs. It turns out that we've been using chat as the interface for a long time. It's just been with a human.
Right.
And we just have a natural template for how to interact with those organizations. Now, our approach lets the LLM take the majority of those. There's always going to be room for human data analysts. There's always going to be more advanced analytics that the LLMs can handle. But it takes first line of defense for those, basically. And we ask, this is our marketing team makes us ask this to everyone, basically. What has been the volume? And let's figure out how many fewer requests you get now that the LLM is watching keeping an eye on things, basically. The standard sort of number that we see is about 80%.
Oh, wow.
I think a good example. Yeah. And we've actually had some of our users even higher than that. If I recall correctly, one of our customers is a company called Tiny Beans. They have it's a sort of an app for families. So it's like children's photos, sharing with the grandparents, things like that. Tiny Beans had a couple person data team, and they're in a very data intensive business. It's a consumer app. And their number was actually 90% when we asked them. It can get even higher than that. And they said it's dramatically reduced the number of requests that they have to field, so they can spend their time sort of building and maintaining the high leverage activities. So it's actually like putting out new tools for people. And again, spending more time on those advanced analytics where you need a human instead of a robot.
Very, very interesting. What does your semantic layer allow customers to do that gives them confidence in Zenalytic?
Yeah, this is a great chance to discuss the limitations of those LLMs. Now, one of the biggest limitations of LLMs is hallucination. And I think everyone's familiar with this now. It's actually, I think this became the Oxford Dictionary word of the year for 2023, right. Hallucination. That's usually tolerable. So if you're using Midjourney and they put an extra person in the back of the scene or something like that, that's probably okay. You can iterate on that. If you're writing a blog post with ChatGPT and it adds a bad paragraph in the middle, you can cut it out. When you're working with data, you can't hallucinate random data. So like in business intelligence, trust is a non-renewable resource. And I'll illustrate with an example, which is if you're trying to get LLMs to write SQL directly, the state of the art is about 85% accuracy. It's measured on this sort of evaluation set called Spider. And the best is 85% of the time you can write the correct SQL query. So if you had a business, and that's 85% accurate, is good for a lot of things. It's nowhere near close what you need for BI. If you have a dashboard that randomly hallucinates a completely fictitious conversion rate or churn rate 1 time out of 7, people are very quickly going to give up on that tool and the dashboard. They're just going to say, this tool is wrong too often. I'm not going to bother with it. This is a major limitation. This is just not acceptable for anyone using data, but especially Imagine if you are a public company doing public company reporting, or if you're a HIPAA compliant company doing HIPAA compliant reporting. Anything requires a greater degree of accuracy than that 85% number. That's why we use the semantic layer. The semantic layer is essentially a tool that takes all of your organization's metrics and slices. You slice gross sales by state. Those would both actually be predefined in the semantic layer. And then it will compile sort of those sorts of requests into SQL queries using old school computing. This is not using LLMs at
Right.
all. I think that's an important element for product design with LLMs, that people are trying to use them for everything now. But I think the right approach is to only use an LLM when you've exhausted all of the possibilities in traditional. In this case, you have these things that you can actually write SQL already using regular computing. They're hard to build, but they're 100% accurate, right? If you ask for sales by state, it will never give you a stochastic kind of unpredictable response. It will give you sales by state in a SQL query form. So this semantic layer is important for several reasons. It first ensures that accuracy and no randomness from the LLMs as a result. It's also really important because it gives context to the LLM. And what I mean by that is that if you were to take my co-founder Paul, who's better at writing SQL than anyone I've ever met, and you were to drop him into a data warehouse and say, hey, listen, tell me my conversion rate, he would probably get it wrong without any context, right? He doesn't know how the organization measures conversion rate or any of the sort of little nuances that go into that. Those can all be captured in the semantic layer in advance. And that's why it helps humans, LLMs, anybody actually access and make sense of data faster and more accurately. And yeah, it's really neat. It's funny because these semantic layers existed before LLMs, and they contain a lot of plain English stuff. So think like descriptions of
Yeah.
what your metrics are, metric names. And those were designed for humans, but it turns out they're actually really useful for the LLMs as well. And we've built this sort of, the data industry has collectively built these semantic layers, and they are the clearest picture of how an organization thinks and acts and analyzes its data that's available. Our approach requires a semantic layer, so we are a semantic layer native tool, and that is an essential unlock for us delivering the sort of performance that you can get from a tool.
So is there a bit of a learning curve for the tool in terms of understanding the nuances and specific idiosyncrasies of a particular company?
I would say there's a learning curve in any tool. In our case, I think there's a stronger learning curve for the person who's administering the tool. So if you're setting up the tool and you're setting up the semantic layer, that's a technical job. So the person who actually sets that up is going to write essentially the descriptions of each of the metrics in a structured
Okay, right.
language way. There's a learning curve for that. Our goal for the end users is to flatten that curve as much as possible. The LLM makes that actually quite easy to do. And our stated goal actually inside the company is that we don't want anyone to ever put Zenalytic as a skill on their CV or
Right.
on their resume. The same way you read a resume and someone puts, I'm good at Microsoft Word, and you think, okay, why would you put that on there? I want people to feel the same way about Zenalytic. Right now, if you're good at SQL, definitely we'll put that on your resume. If you're good at using Tableau, that's a complex enough tool that you'll say that on your resume. Yes, I'm good at Tableau. But we want to make Zenalytic easy enough to use that would feel silly to have it on your CV.
Sure. And what are some common frustrations you hear from potential customers around self-serve BI or ad hoc requests?
Yeah. I think one great example comes from last week we spoke with a really large financial services organization. They're a Tableau user. And I think the quote was something like, our Tableau contract is $2 million a year. We have 3,000 seats and nobody uses data. And I think that's a common
Right.
complaint. It's the funny thing is that it takes huge amounts of investment, right? So like I mentioned the FANGs as being leaders in this space, and they become worldwide. They become generational businesses as a result, but they got there through tremendous amounts of investment, right? Facebook has how many tens of thousands of engineers do these organizations have, and how many thousands of engineers are dedicated to maintaining these data infrastructures and making sure it's accessible to the rest of the team. It's a very big investment, and as a result, not everyone can make that investment, and they have all this data, but they're unable to use it. Is what that bottleneck ends in. I will say it's getting easier and easier to make that investment. That's the modern data stacks side of the coin, basically. It's made it much easier to build and maintain data pipelines. So as the bar gets lower, we're seeing organizations earlier and earlier start to deploy these tools. And for example, even when we started building Zenalytic, we would go into a 150-person organization or a 200-person organization, and we would ask what they're using for data, and they'd usually just say Excel. There'd be no formal data system set up for a company of that organization, like of that size, right? Because it was difficult to do. Thanks to all the tools that I mentioned earlier, having great web UIs and things like that. We just went on a call yesterday with a company. They were a D2C brand, and there were 25 people, and they had a full data stack set up. They had their data warehouse prepared, and they had an ingestion tool, and they had transformation tools. And they didn't have a full-time data person at that point in time. That was managed by their finance director, who's non-technical. So the bar for actually doing this continually goes lower and lower. And as a result, we're seeing many more companies adopting more robust data
I'd
pipelines.
imagine that for data teams used to being the single source of truth, that the transition could be a little bit difficult. So I'm curious, how do you build trust in handing questions over to Zenlytic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say it's funny you mentioned data teams being the single source of truth. That's absolutely true. And there's a funny transition point in every data team's sort of life cycle when the systems they build become the systems of record. And what I mean by that is when they start, it's a side project. It's, oh, yeah, we're going to have some data teams here. We're going to have the analytics data. And then there's the iteration, there's bugs to be worked out, there's fixing that conversion rate, there's making sure the data is clean and reliable. That's phase one. Phase two is you have the clean and reliable data, people start to adopt it. And it's, oh, wow, yeah, so we can go to this if we want to know which SKUs are going to be out of stock. We can go to this if we know which, we want to have the most accurate CRM for our sales pipeline. We should probably go to the data tool. People start to realize that. And somewhere in the middle of that phase, people have this sort of realization that's essential. And then suddenly the conversation shifts into phase three, which is like, how do we make sure this is accessible at all times? And suddenly the data team, who spent all their time just trying to be viewed as credible, they're mission critical, and there's pager duty happening, and they're making sure that someone from the data team is on call 24/7 in case there's an issue with the data warehouse. And it's a very different sort of environment to work in. I would say just generally, there's always that evolution of trust in the organization that's independent of Zenalytic, basically. But for us specifically, I'd say the best tool we have is the tool. And what I mean by that is that people are always asking the question, is this going to be right? Can we trust it? And the most powerful way we've had to show people that is letting them demo it. And we let people use the tool. We usually do a game called 20 questions. So we'll go to a data team and we'll say, all right, go through your emails, give us the last 20 questions that you've been asked from your end users. Or if you don't track those, give us some common ones or some questions that you think that will be difficult to answer or things like that. And sometimes it takes a polish pass if there's a metric definition that's not set correctly or something like that. But after either a couple or after the first set of questions, they send it over and we'll just send it back and say, okay, here's the answer for this. And the number is usually 20 to 20, frankly. And then people are, okay, I see that. I get this is accurate. That's one of the benefits by minimizing the LLM use. I would say the other important factor here for building trust, again, comes back to product design. It comes back to transparency about what you're doing. If you were to go into Zoe, our chatbot, and just say, hey, how have our sales been trending this month versus the same time last year? Zoe will give you that, but Zoe might make an inference and say, oh, they're talking about sales. I'm going to give them gross sales. And that could be the wrong metric that you're thinking about. Sometimes language is imprecise. It's hard to get that. Maybe you wanted to have your net revenue instead of your gross revenue. That happens, but it's not an issue in Zoe because Zoe is always very transparent about what's being shown. So before you see that plot of revenue versus last month, so that same time last year, before you see that, Zoe will actually articulate, listen, this is your gross revenues. I'm using these metrics. This is the date that I'm doing this by order date. Here's the data. And it's auditable by the end user. This is another advantage over those sort of text to SQL approaches because the feedback mechanism there is a SQL query. The best they could do is say, all right, here's the SQL query that I'm going to run here. And that's not necessarily understandable to everyone if you don't understand SQL. A big part of our philosophy is providing that plain language feedback so everyone always knows what's going on.
I'm assuming that there's a lot of emotion involved as people go through this change process with using Zenlytic. How would you say you've seen data teams evolve emotionally after adopting Zenlytic?
Yeah, that's funny. I would say we occasionally encounter data teams that are concerned, where it's okay, if I do this, am I still going to have a
Yeah.
job or not? And I guess that can be an emotional journey. I think that this is not a unique problem to just our
Mhm.
industry. I think everyone's asking this question with LLMs in general, right? And I think that's actually never going to be a problem. I think pretty much every piece of technology people
Mhm.
have asked this, and because of that, what's it called? The limits of labor law. I think it's a rule that shows that if these tools make things cheaper, then that actually expands the size of the economy, and it makes more
Mhm.
jobs for everybody, right? And that's why that even though we've had all these technical advancements that have been disrupting jobs, we had loom operators 300 years ago that were dramatically changed because looms became automated, things like that. It still creates a huge amount of opportunity and just it lets you do higher leverage activities with
Mhm.
your time, generally speaking. I think of the best example of that is not even a jobs related, but it's like when the British Navy 200 years ago was going to try to figure out if they were going to run out of coal or not. The British Navy ran on coal, and the UK has a lot of coal, but they were concerned because the size of the Navy was expanding. They said, no, no problem. It's okay. These coal ships are becoming more efficient every year, and we're going to use less and less coal. Let's just get more efficient. But actually, what happens is those ships, as they become more efficient, you end up building more and more ships. So it just expands the size of the overall Navy, basically. That's very true for jobs
Right.
as well. And I think what we see data teams do is it frees up the least desirable part of their day. The way I see it, data teams have three main jobs. The first one is building and maintaining data tools. The second is these ad hoc data requests. And the third is what I would call the more advanced analytics. And those are the things that require domain expertise, statistical knowledge, and you're running experimentations and A B tests and running P tests and the things that require some pretty advanced knowledge of data. Interestingly, data teams love to do the first one. They love building tools that are high leverage on their time, right? They love the last one, of
Mhm.
course, because advanced analytics are cool. The one they really don't like is the middle one, the ad hoc data requests. But that's where they spend most of their time, right? So, like, over half of your time as a data person is spent just closing out tickets or replying to emails or just helping people fix something on a dashboard or whatever.
Mhm.
All of the very sort of mundane things. So, I would say the emotional journey for those data teams that are originally concerned, by the time they're finished, they're elated because they've essentially taken a whole bunch of that grunt work off of their plate so they can focus on even more high leverage
Mhm.
activities.
So, and the ability to interact with Zenalytic, I'm assuming is like a conversation with a data engineer. I take it it's Zoe, the chatbot that is used
Right.
to have these conversations. That's an interesting concept, and I'm curious, what does that user experience look like if you're trying to emulate a conversation with a data engineer?
Yeah, that is our North Star. And that is why I think that I'm so glad to be working in the data industry because we have a very common usage pattern for how people chat with
Hmm.
data. That's through a human. If we were building I don't know, CRM or something like that, then we don't have a good example of how people want to chat with
Hmm.
Salesforce or whatever. Or if you're building Figma, it's like, how does chat integrate into your tool? In the BI space, we actually have been doing this. The last BI tool, the next generation of BI tools is going to be the same as the original BI tool, which is just that chat, which is great. I would say we've had a few interesting surprises with it. I would say the absolutely people very quickly learn they can just ask these sort of plain questions, things like that. One of the bigger surprises for me is that sometimes people struggle with the tyranny of the empty page. So if you just give them a blank page in a chatbot and it's, hi, what would you like to do? People don't, they're like, I don't know. And it increases usability dramatically just to have a simple message at the start.
Right.
Hi, I'm Zoe. Listen, you can ask me about some metrics. Here are the metrics that are most commonly
Hmm.
asked about. And here's 5 examples. Here are the sort of questions that you can ask. You can ask about this, and here's the sort of questions that I can answer, and here's how I address those. So that little bit of guidance at the start helps people a lot. And I would say even more, a big surprise we had was that almost the majority of our usage does not start on the empty page. But afterthought, we included a quick thing on our dashboard functionality where you can hit the little three dot menu and you can say, ask a question to Zoe
Hmm.
from here. And it will pre-populate that dashboard, and that becomes the starting point for your
Right.
question. So and we thought that'd be a nice thing to have, but to our surprise, it became one of our most popular
Mm.
features. And I guess it just goes down to really deeply understanding your user. It goes down to understanding their flows. And in this case, like I said at the start of this conversation, dashboards aren't dead. A lot of their flows still start from a dashboard. And then again, if we're trying to emulate that conversation with the data analyst, those data analyst conversations usually start with the dashboard too, right? Someone sees something's unusual. They want to dig deeper into that. So by adding that, it's probably been the most native, natural feeling integration that people have really loved. It's an interesting learning experience. And I think this is actually true of pretty much everyone who's working with LLMs. This is a pretty fundamentally new way to interact with computers, right? So like when I was a VC, I watched the last wave of UI progress, which was driven by
Yeah.
mobile. And that was led by easy to understand tools, very simple tools, minimalist tools, very clear workflows. And there's a set of design principles. I remember a time in 2011 to 2013 or so where being really good at UI UX design was a competitive advantage, right? So if there were multiple, I don't know, tools for buying and selling event tickets online, the one that was the most beautiful and the one that was the easiest to use would generally win. And then as everyone figured it out, everyone started using the best practices. We're actually in that stage now for
Right.
LLMs. This is, like I said, a new way of interacting with computers. A lot of people don't really know yet what the proper usage patterns look like. And some people are building things that look like WhatsApp, a whole chat interface. Some people are building things that look like GitHub Copilot, where there's a little sidebar for things. Some people are embedding this inside traditional UI elements. So if you go to use Notion AI, for instance, you can select text, you can right click on it. It gives you a few sample prompts or an open one at the end, but there's no chatbot
Yeah.
in there, for instance, like you'd see in a lot of other chat driven tools. I'm pretty excited to see where it lands. And I actually don't know where it's going to land. I don't think anyone does yet. And I think it's going to take us, same thing, probably a couple of years of experimentation to really find the dominant design patterns for this generation.
Very interesting space, I'm sure. I was just thinking about flat metrics, and I'm curious, how would Zenalytics explain changes in that context? Yeah, and I was wondering if you could throw in an example to help us understand that.
It's funny you mentioned that because this is actually even before LLMs, we had this functionality added. This is using, again, we have ways of doing this traditional computing, so let's not use an LLM for it. So Zenalytic has a feature that can explain changes in your metrics. And what that means is if you have a sudden spike in your churn rate, you can select over that and you can say,
Right.
explain why
Yeah.
this churn rate spike happened. And it will run a deep search across your warehouse and it will say, oh, that churn rate happened. Like 25% of that was from people who had expired credit cards. Another 30% were for people who had bought at a discounted plan a year earlier. And apparently that discount makes less durability with your users. And then 15% of them had been extensive users of this feature, which you had just recently changed and whatever. It'll give explanations for that. And one of our other surprises when we got to watch over the shoulders of our users and do some user testing is that we saw people explaining the change on flat metrics. And there'd be a conversion rate that had gone between, 25.8% and 26.1% for the last 3 months, but they would still select over that and say, hey, explain what's happening in this change. And we'd say, wait a minute, nothing's changed. What are you trying to explain? And they would tell us that even though nothing was happening on the surface, look at this. And they'd show us the results of the change would essentially be a whole bunch of factors, both positive and negative, that netted out to flat. But they said, this is still very helpful for me because I can double down on the positives, right? Maybe I figure out this is working and we're just going to put more resources behind this. I could eliminate the negatives and basically I can still bend the flat metric by seeing what's driving it. And it's just interesting. It's like they use the example of when you're in 10th grade biology and you put a little petri dish drop of water and you look in the microscope and there's all sorts of stuff you can't see on the surface. But when you break things apart, suddenly you find actionable opportunities. And I'm originally from Canada. I'm a big hiker, backcountry guy. And there's an old saying in the hiker community where you save the ounces, save the pounds. I've never heard that, but it's if you're hiking in and you want to save 10 pounds in your pack, you start by shaving off the back of your toothbrush, which is only whatever,
Yeah.
half an ounce. But you do enough of those things and they add up. And that's also true that metrics are improved one small innovation at a time. And yes, maybe your conversion rate, you find something that improves it by 25 basis points or something like that, a tiny little amount, but you find half a dozen of those, or you find a dozen of those, and suddenly that conversion rate that was previously flat has been flexed from 26 to 30%, and then that compounds through the organization, and then you have twice as much money on the bottom line to reinvest back into the organization, and that helps you grow faster. And it just moving those metrics can really matter. And eventually, if you're a big organization and if you're doing $1 billion a year in revenue, and you can improve your conversion rate by 0.1%, you're still talking about whatever millions and millions of dollars of impact through making these small changes. Yeah, that was a big learning
Yeah,
for us. I was pretty surprised to see that. But yes, people are actually explaining the changes in flat metrics.
brilliant. I'm sure there's a lot more we could unpack, but I'm curious, as experts who have enabled a breakthrough in self-serve analytics, what lessons have you learned about driving the adoption of disruptive technology that could apply more broadly across industries?
Yeah, I would. It's really interesting. You asked that. I think about this a lot. As when I was a VC, like a lot of people, I'd read the book Crossing the Chasm. You're probably familiar with that, and it's a seminal book. It's a seminal. Everyone talks about the seminal book, and it's. I think I read it because it's a well-written book, and I think it gets a lot of praise. But I really didn't internalize it until we started selling really forward-looking disruptive technology ourselves. And having lived life of a practitioner, I've been surprised by how accurate that book is. And that very much has formed a framework for my thoughts. In the early days of Zenalytic, before we were a mature, polished tool, I remember we had like a certain class of sales call from people who were really enthusiastic with the technology and really forward thinking. And we would show them a demo, and they'd be like, things would be breaking in the demo, and they're like, "Oh, this is okay. This is going to work later, and whatever." And the person on the other side of the call didn't seem to mind that there's things breaking and things like that. And we'd be like, "Okay, sorry the demo broke. Have a nice life." And they'd say, "No, I want to buy this." And we'd be like, "Really?" And yeah, and they'd say, "Listen, I know y'all are early, but I can really see where this is going to be in a year's time. It's I can see how fast this sort of technology is changing. I think you're on to. I think that your team is the right one to deliver it. Y'all are shipping effectively. You're doing really well, and I still want to be a part of this." And that class of person is essential when you're selling disruptive tech, especially in the early stages. But finding those people is super duper important. And I would say the question that becomes, how do you find them and how do you mature
Yeah.
them and things like that? I think one of the interesting takeaways I've had from that is that when you're dealing with those people, the right way to ultimately sign a deal with them or quickly sign a deal with them is not to show a really robust product. It's not even to show a really good roadmap. They can use their own vision to understand where it's going the same way you can. But you can establish a ton of credibility with them by showing fast time to ship and just fast responsiveness to their suggestions. These are the sort of people that want to be a collaborator on the product. One of the reasons why they want to buy the product early is because they're going to get a voice at the table and they're going to say, "We like these features and this is how you should do this." And that feedback is very much appreciated on the other side. You want those people. And when we found ourselves in a sales process like that, and we'd say, "All right, this is someone who sees the vision and they want to be a part of this," that's great. We'd definitely make sure to communicate how fast we were shipping our roadmap. So it's like, "All right, hey, look, we just did this and this." And throughout the course of the sales process, if it's a 6-week sales process, if you can ship a few meaningful features, that goes a very long way in that sales process. And I guess secondly, we would show them a high excitement for collaborating with them. As they tested stuff, this sort of person always gives lots of very good feedback on what they'd like to see or what works and what doesn't work. And if you can show responsiveness to that and an eagerness to actually work with them on that has a tremendously positive impact on a sales process. And I think that's the right way to ultimately like close someone like that. And so I think it's really important. I think the other important thing that I was surprised with there is that those sorts of people I always expected to be in smaller organizations. So it's like you have a small organization and you have a big risk averse enterprise organization. I was surprised to learn in our experience that those folks are actually fairly evenly distributed. By size is not a confounder in that equation. So we would see definitely smaller orgs like that. We'd also see a lot of forward-thinking enterprise orgs where there'd be a person who managed a 30-person data team who was excited to co-build with us and use this their organization. My second learning would be don't discount large organizations, and people like that can be found anywhere.
Certainly. Some experts would argue that customer stories and word of mouth will be more critical to SaaS growth than paid advertising in the years ahead. But I'm curious, do you see Zenalytic growth being fueled in that way? If so, why or why not?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. I would say that might be the big elbow point for any new SaaS business. I like to think about things in terms of archetypes, but I would say a pretty important transition of the maturity level of your business would be the point that you have customer stories versus the point that you don't. So like when you move from that point where you actually have other customer references, that feels like the start of a new era, and it's then you have very different sales conversations, etc. So yeah, that was essential for us. It gets 10 times easier when you have some great social proof where you can share with people and now pretty much across the pipeline, right? So it actually is, it's great for conversion, but it's also great for top of funnel. When you really wow people that are working with your product, they can be an excellent source of really warm conversations as well. And then of course it works wonders for conversion.
Absolutely. Ryan, in this space of self-serve BI, do you find that there are perhaps a couple of areas that don't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
Not if I can help it. I'm not sure if you see my LinkedIn or not, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
thought leadership. Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's a rapidly changing space. It feels every 6 months there's a new thing. Basically, for the past 6 months, everyone's been talking about data contracts, and there's gonna be another thing after that. So people tend to explore a lot of the space. I would say one thing that I really notice about data is that it feels like I feel like people are mistakenly reinventing things all the time, right? And this is true of all verticals. But what I mean by that is that now there's a big discussion around semantic layers and how they're important. And the entire data community seems to have rediscovered semantic layers. But this is really the third generation of BI tools that have had really good semantic layers in them. The last generation was Looker and LookML, very popular. Wasn't even called a semantic layer then. And then before that, SAP Business Objects had a very robust semantic layer in the 2000s. Now we've discovered semantic layers, and everyone thinks that it's this amazing brand new discovery, even though it's just the rediscovery of an existing best practice. And so I would say one thing I think about one of my mental models for thinking about these industries is what has been forgotten that's a best practice. And it's funny to think that industries do that, but it really seems to happen a lot. And one example of that right now is that I feel like now that we've had a resurgence in the semantic layer, there's a resurgence in discussions around data modeling. Okay, it's a boring topic for most people. It's actually really exciting for the data community. But for the past 5-6 years, there's been this kind of unstructured approach where you throw everything over the fence and it's like, all right, let's just get the data in and then do some stuff, and whatever works for you, just do it. And now we're reaching the other part of the cycle where it's like, oh wait, we can standardize this. There's best practices, and you can use a Kimball star schema to do this, and that's how most lead organizations have done this in the past, and they did that for a reason. It turns out it works, and there's a return to that. So I would say in the general case, it's just interesting that there's best practices tend to wax and wane. And if you want to have a good idea of what's coming next, I would actually probably take a good hard look at what was happening 5 years
Right.
ago, and figure out what was short term, what was a perennial best practice, and how does that exist under new technology.
A great insight there. And to wrap up, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
I would say my top takeaway is that Ryan's a big nerd. What's funny is because I'm a big nerd, I was talking about data a lot. And if you're not a data person listening to this, you're probably like, okay, that's super boring. So I would say the real takeaway here is on the AI side. It's interesting because AI is obviously very hyped, and we're actually just recording this just after the Sam OpenAI succession weekend, and everyone's just been glued to the world of AI, and it's a very discussed phenomenon. I actually think that because it's happening on the back of the rapid rise and fall of crypto, that people are taking it less seriously than they should. So I think AI would actually be a bigger deal if people weren't gun shy from the last big wave being a flash in the pan. We're close with this technology. I am blown away by how quickly it got good. So like I'm thinking about LLMs, I'm thinking about image generation. And even if you turned off all AI development today, it's going to have a transformative impact on the world with the current technology. I think that because of GitHub Copilot, our engineering team is somewhere like 25 to 50% more efficient. And that's true of every engineering team. Like engineering teams just got 50% faster. Like what impact does that have on the world? It lowers the bar. I think about if you go on the Midjourney Discord, there's hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions of people that are now artists that could not have been artists a year ago. It just unlocks all this stuff. And like we just did a little thing at a show where we built Datamon cards, like a collectible monster card game, and they were personalized. You put someone's LinkedIn profile in, and a card comes out with a customized picture of them. It's like a little Datamon and funny little copy and things like that. And it was hugely successful. Just everyone loved it. And I was thinking to myself at that show, this was not possible to do a year ago. If we were going to do this a year ago, we would have been hiring digital artists or
Yeah.
something to do this, and we would have been able to make 10 Datamon cards instead of 1,000 of them. And things, the capabilities of this tech have been really profound. I don't think we've even explored all the capabilities yet. It takes 6 to 12 months to make an MVP for a really good product, and we're coming up on the 9-month anniversary of GPT-4 now. We're just at the start of seeing these tools being disseminated at the application layer. I think when this technology does, it's going to change every software vertical. I think it's going to have huge impacts on how we interact with software. That's just using today's technology. That's just using what has happened up until now. And like we said at the start of the call, this technology is changing faster than ever before. It continues to accelerate. And it's such a massive scale. I have a hard time even mapping out like what the world looks like 6 to 12 months from now. I think it's going to change a lot of how we interact with software. I'm pretty excited by that. And I think that should be the takeaway. And I know that I sound like one of those, I should be on Twitter with like laser eyes or something in my profile picture. I would say I'm actually a very conservative, kind of cynical guy that is, I tend to second guess the latest technological advancements. But yeah, I really believe that there is something pretty important happening with AI, and the faster you can start using it, the better off you're going to
And
be.
if listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
I'd probably go to LinkedIn. Just connect to me on LinkedIn, Ryan Janssen, 2 S's. You can go to Zenalytic.com. You can find my details on there as well. Yeah, hit me up. I'm on Twitter, but I spend more time on LinkedIn these days. So yeah, Ryan Janssen on LinkedIn. That's
We'll
where to go.
include links to that in the show notes. Ryan, thank you so much for sharing. It's been very enlightening.
Vinay, thanks so much
No
for having me.
worries.